So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's event on recognizing and responding to genocide denial, hosted by the Aegis Trust. I'm Dr. Catherine Gilbert, a research fellow in modern languages at Newcastle University in the UK. I've been working with survivors of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi for several years now, and I'm particularly interested in the ways in which the memory of the genocide is transmitted through testimony, commemoration, and education. So it's a real honor for me to be introducing today's event on recognizing and responding to genocide denial. But before we get going, I'd just like to explain the format of today's event. And I'll just make sure we've muted everyone's microphones so that there aren't background noises coming in. Okay. So I'll first give a brief introduction to explain our rationale for organizing this event and to introduce our 5 speakers. I will then pass over to my colleague, Dr. Caroline Williamson-Sinalo, who will facilitate the discussion with the panelists. Rather than asking our panelists to prepare individual presentations, we'll be putting a series of questions to the panelists, giving each speaker time to respond in order to draw out a range of perspectives and enable a more free-flowing dialogue. And this discussion will last approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes. We will then have 30 minutes at the end of the discussion for audience Q&A. So please do write your questions in the questions tab that you can see on the live storm screen as we go through the discussion so that I can then put these to the panelists at the end. If we receive more questions than can be answered in the 30 minutes, which we anticipate is very likely to be the case, then I'll attempt to group the questions together and select those which most closely relate to the topic of today's discussion. So just a few words of introduction now. Denial of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda has significantly increased in recent years, with prominent intellectuals and journalists finding a growing voice in the mainstream media and in academic institutions. We've been prompted to organize this event in response, for example, to the appearance of Canadian journalist Judy Reaver, whose book In Praise of Blood promotes the theory of double genocide, at Cambridge University in April of this year, and also to the recent release of British journalist Michaela Wrong's book, Do Not Disturb, which has received very favourable coverage in mainstream media in the UK and beyond. As Gregory Stanton of Genocide Watch reminds us, denial is the final stage of genocide. But we have to remember that denial is also central to the genocidal process from the very beginning. Genocide denial is a painful form of extremism that stems from the ideology of genocide itself. This denial takes many forms. Often it's no longer simply a case of outright denial, but of a slippery and evolving discourse that avoids being identified for what it is. Today, we see more insidious forms of denial and revisionism, couched in language seeming to promote democracy and human rights, to make these seem like reasonable, balanced views. But ultimately, these views are underpinned by the very ideology that led to the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994. Many of these forms of denial are intended to sow doubts about the veracity of the history of the genocide without openly denying that it happened. So you often hear phrases like, "We do not deny that there was a genocide, but..." The intention here is to distort, to mislead, and to deceive. And it is crucial that we remain vigilant and capable of recognizing and responding to genocide denial in whatever form it appears. The popularity of digital platforms such as Twitter have also contributed to the rapid spread of genocide denial to a wide public audience. It's very easy for people to put their denialist arguments into sound bites on these largely unmoderated platforms, which poses a growing challenge for combating genocide denial. Engaging with this digital space demands huge amounts of energy and effort, and we need to think through strategies and actions we can take in response, and how we can best share our expertise and pool our resources and energies as we confront these painful and often hateful interactions. So we've organized this panel today to bring together Rwandan and international experts from academia and civil society working on issues related to the genocide against the Tutsi and its denial. We feel it's important to address the many forms of genocide denial that we increasingly encounter today, and to think through the ways that we can strengthen our response to denial when we encounter it. The questions we will pose to the panelists today will prompt them to address genocide denial in its many manifestations, delineating the major arguments of genocide deniers and the forms and patterns denial takes. They will also consider the consequences of genocide denial, both in terms of its immediate impact on the survivor community, as well as its broader impact on public opinion and political decision-making. Finally, through today's discussion, we want to reflect on how we as a community should respond collectively to genocide denial in a general sense, but also in specific cases where known genocide deniers are given a public platform. So I'd like now to introduce our distinguished speakers. Because there are 5 of them, I will just give very brief introductions in alphabetical order. Dr. Richard Bender is a tutor in contextual and practical theology and a research fellow at Luther King Center for Theology and Ministry. He specializes in the complex interactions between religious beliefs and political agency, and his current research explores intergenerational dialogues on guilt, shame, transformation, and accountability in the aftermath of the genocide. Phil Clark is a professor of international politics and co-convener of the Centre on Conflict, Rights and Justice at SOAS, University of London. He has written extensively on post-genocide justice, reconciliation and memorialization in Rwanda, and on the politics of the International Criminal Court in Africa. In 2014, he founded the Aegis Trust Programme on Research, Policy and Higher Education, RPHE, and is currently an RPHE advisor. Linda Melvin is a British investigative journalist who, for the past 27 years, has researched and written exclusively about the circumstances of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. Her 3 books on the subject are A People Betrayed, The Role of the West in Rwanda's Genocide, first published in 2000, Conspiracy to Murder, The Rwandan Genocide, published in 2004, and most recently, Intent to Deceive, Denying the Genocide of the Tutsi, which came out just last year in 2020. Paul Rikesha is a digital content development coordinator at the Kigali Genocide Memorial. Graduating in sociology from the University of Rwanda in 2007, he has worked for over a decade at the Kigali Genocide Memorial with the Aegis Trust, documenting eyewitness testimony and coordinating major projects for the Genocide Archive of Rwanda and National Archives Rwanda. And finally, Dr. James Smith, CBE, is co-founder of the UK's National Holocaust Centre and Museum, which was established in 1995, and of the Aegis Trust, founded in 2000. In 2004, he worked with survivors and the Kigali City Council to establish the Kigali Genocide Memorial in Rwanda's capital, the base from which Aegis Trust's peace education programme has been developed. He is an author, editor, and contributor to multiple films and publications on the Holocaust and genocide. And of course, our moderator is Dr. Caroline Williamson-Sinalo, who is a lecturer in world languages at University College Cork. She is author of Rwanda After Genocide, Gender Identity and Post-Traumatic Growth, which was published with Cambridge University Press in 2018. Her research focuses on conflict in Africa's Great Lakes region, touching on a broad range of themes, including testimony and trauma, parenting, disclosure and intergenerational transmission, media representations of conflict, and gender issues. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for agreeing to be here today. And I'd like to remind you, the audience, to share your questions in the questions tab during the discussion so that we can address as many as possible in the Q&A. So I will now hand over to Caroline.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And I'd like to also just add my thanks to all of our panelists for being here today to discuss this really important topic. So the format for the discussion itself is going to be a series of 4 brief answer questions. So I'm going to put each of these 4 questions to all of the panelists before we move on to the next one. So our first question is, how does genocide denial manifest itself? And prompts to this question might be things like the major arguments of genocide deniers, the patterns of genocide denial and the tactics adopted, as well as the various forms of media and the different platforms that deniers might use. So how does genocide denial manifest itself? And I'd like to put this question first to Dr. James Smith. So over to you. James, you're muted.
Thank you, Caroline. And it's not always useful to use the Holocaust as a benchmark. But in a situation of denial, it is helpful to look back and look at how denial has developed over the course of 70, 80 years. It's very rare for, certainly now, for the Holocaust and any genocide to be denied outright. We remember there were notorious deniers such as David Irving, who one stage was gaining traction, but now those kind of ideas and theories are only common in the most sort of extremist groups. A much greater problem and challenge of denial is that which sort of minimizes, undermines, and distorts the history. I know that we're here to talk about genocide against the Tutsi, denial, and there's others will be speaking specifically about that. But I just want to frame some of the arguments that have been used in relation to undermining the Holocaust, and they began even before the Holocaust. And this was, first of all, this concept of defending yourself against what would become the victims. There was even a committee set up by the notorious propagandist Julius Streicher, the Committee Against Jewish Atrocities. And this was emblazoned during the boycott as early as boycott against Jews as early as April 1933. So this notion that the Germans had to defend themselves against atrocities of Jews began at a very early stage, and it continued all the way through the 1930s and really escalated at the beginning of the Second World War, and then continued and continues today, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. And it's this part of the narrative is around how, well, certainly in relation to the sort of Baltic states and the former Soviet states, is that, well, Jews were prominent Bolsheviks, and therefore they were occupiers. They were creating, causing atrocities of their own in these states, and the Nazis and their collaborators were merely liberating the population from the oppression of the Jews. And so this double genocide theory developed, was propagated during the time. Of course, it wasn't called genocide then, because the term hadn't been invented in the early 1940s. But the concept of double genocide theories was happening during the time, the propaganda of the Nazis, and continues right up to this present day. And so it's much more difficult to address. And I'll just end with this point, because I know others need to come in. But we saw many examples of this. One, for example, would be in Lithuania, where the former head of Yad Vashem, Yitzhak Arad, who had been a member of the Soviet security apparatus when he was only 18 years old, was prosecuted by the Lithuanian authorities. So all the tens of thousands of collaborators that were involved in exterminating the Jews of Lithuania were sort of, that was put to one side and minimized, and a focus on the handful of Jewish partisans that may or may not have been part of the Soviet system. And so both through the historical narrative, narratives that were being promoted, and through academic articles in Lithuania, and then through the courts, this narrative was created and persists. And it's often very difficult. It's often insidious, as you said, Catherine, at the beginning. And we're seeing echoes of that happening again before, during, and after the genocide against the Tutsi. But I'm sure others will be able to expand on that point. But there certainly are parallels between what happened the kind of tactics of denial and distortion of the Holocaust and that of the genocide against the Tutsi.
Thanks very much, James. And very useful to see the comparison there with the Holocaust. So I'll now hand over to Linda Melvin. So same question, please. How does genocide denial manifest itself?
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for asking me to share with you today what has been 27 years research into the circumstances of this great crime. From the moment the genocidal Hutu power movement seized control of the state, it had determined to distort the reality of events in lies, distortion, and propaganda. It spread, and I remember this, and this is described in my book, it spread fake news in the hallways of the UN as the crime was getting underway. And these claims made by Rwandan ambassadors at the UN were later used as the foundation stones of the denial to come. Deniers of genocide misinterpret and manipulate the historical evidence that serves to lessen the crime. They cast doubt on the joint criminal enterprise to commit genocide. They claim a pro-Tutsi lobby has fooled the world, a campaign expertly orchestrated by the Rwandan Patriotic Front and its allies. The official story is completely wrong. This was exactly how Colonel Thienes Bagosora defended himself in his trial, and it was a part of his defense case. Bagosora even provided the numbers of the missiles he claimed the RPF used to shoot down the plane. He said there was no planning. The population turned on one another in chaotic circumstances. Deniers of this genocide agree with Bagosora. They too claim the whole world has been fooled. The real truth has been suppressed, and there's an alternative version that they have uncovered during so-called journalistic research, and they have produced an insightful expose. The denial of the genocide that first manifested itself in the UN Security Council lives on in the work of academics and journalists. It's sponsored and encouraged by French army officers and politicians. This disinformation campaign, a fact confirmed in the recent and vital report by Vincent Duclerc in the French Commission report. The deniers reduce the death toll and use it as some macabre parlor game, and they have a way with dodgy statistics. There was a claim made on the BBC documentary Rwanda's Untold Story that only 10% of the intra-Hamwe were killers. This information provided by a witness who was 12 years old in 1994. They used dodgy statistics pre-genocide to claim the minority Tutsi were overrepresented in society. The deniers ignore the quota system to restrict the participation of Tutsi in public life. The racist system in Rwanda had seen agents of the state traveling the country to investigate to see if people were pure Hutu as they claimed, or were hiding their Tutsi blood. There is an entire archive of these investigations. Yet the deniers ignore the racism that underpinned the genocide. They ignore the Hutu power movement. They leave out whole parts of the story that does not accord with their view. They pay no heed to the elimination of political opposition on April the 7th and see only as significant the assassination of Habyarimana. Not for them the coup d'etat by Hutu power. The odious idea that the RPF infiltrated the intra-Hamwe comes from Paul Rusesabagina. He says put Paul Kagame down the plane and therefore was responsible for the deaths of 1 million people. These and other suggestions are all part of the campaign to deny genocide. Their one big lie, perpetrated by the génocidaires and sustained by the deniers, is that the Tutsi provoked genocide, or there was a double genocide in which Tutsi killed Hutu. How can they be deniers if they acknowledge the genocide against the Tutsi took place, as Catherine has said? There is a but. I'm not a denier, but I do think you should know there were 2 genocides, and the victims brought this upon themselves by killing the president, and the population was seeking revenge for his death, and there was chaos and anarchy. Killing of the entire political opposition is just ignored. It is described as unexpected political violence. And this is an idea from a renowned expert in France, André Guichard. The UN peacekeepers died, they claim, because they'd helped the RPF smuggle a missile from Uganda to kill the president. This is just one more conspiracy theory put about by the Genocidaires as part of their fake news campaign. This was an idea spread by the genocidal government's Minister of Foreign Affairs, who claimed the RPF and the UN peacekeepers were guilty of the assassination. There is another version of events, they claim, and only they have discovered it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing the insights from your research into this, Linda. So the same question now to Richard Bender.
Thank you. I'm going to ask just for 30 seconds. We are talking about denial, and the whole conversation is going to be about denying genocide. So I actually wanted to take at least 15 to 30 seconds to just make this very short statement of acknowledgement as a witness to history. And this is that at least between the 7th of April 1994 and the 4th of July 1994, the then government of Rwanda organized, sanctioned, and oversaw the execution of a criminal enterprise, and namely the systematic killing of every Rwandan person known as, said to be, or even suspected to be a Tutsi. This criminal enterprise was later recognized and legally qualified as genocide, and ultimately it was named the genocide against the Tutsi. And indeed, from what I saw as a 20-year-old person, a student in law in Rwanda, this was a criminal enterprise. This criminal enterprise was genocidal in intent, in essence, and in magnitude. So I just wanted to make sure that we actually state out there what people are denying and what we stood and witnessed or lived through in those dark days. I'm not going to repeat what James and Linda have said, because the denial of the Rwandan genocide is not unique. History has shown us that over 70 years and probably more than 100 years, both the Shoah and the genocide, the Armenian genocide, have been constantly denied, which maybe lead us to think that, as Burrell has said, we need a conceptual anatomy of denial to sort through these sort of denial motives and means and users. I'm just going to go quickly to focus on the genocide against the Tutsi. And again, I'm just going to second what Linda said, that genocide denial was already there, present, when the genocide was being executed. And I think if people don't have access to Linda's book, and books can be massive to read, I would just encourage them to read the short piece she wrote on moral equivalence, because I found it quite helpful in terms of showing how the genocide denial was already concomitant with the commission of the genocide. When the genocide against the Tutsi was over in Rwanda, I suppose privileged to be a witness to that momentous time, and it was really interesting to see how the genocidaires themselves, the subtext of their pleas, denoted denial. in terms of saying that, you know, we ignored, we didn't know what we were doing, or we were obeying the law. And I think this pleas of ignorance and obedience are another form of denial. And again, Linda talked about the genocide by provocation argument. I remember talking to one opposition Hutu politician in a Scandinavian country, and he said very bluntly, and he said, listen, we killed the Tutsi, but it is because of them that we killed them. Literally say, nibo batumye tubica. So they caused us to kill them. And this sort of genocide by provocation argument and other quasi-justification based on the threat of internal subversion, as Linda has said, argument of self-defense, and again, appeal to the comforting fogs of war, to use Burrell words, that because of the war, you know, because people are defending themselves, or because of the president died, all those kind of things. But what I really want to focus on is what seems to me to have happened in the mid to late 2000s with the leaking of the Gersonian mapping reports. I think personally that genocide denial has entered a very crucial and very distinct new phase. It has become extremely concerted and more transnational. We have seen increasing networks, alliances, and solidarities of denial have developed between Rwandan and non-Rwandan proponents. And quite crucially, I think the genocide denial has entered a second generational phase where a younger generation is taking over the baton. Clearly, communication technologies and social media platforms have been deployed very efficiently and played a key role in genocide denial. What I find increasingly alarming is the way in which the RPF, its prosecution of the war, its leadership of the country after the genocide, and its leader, Paul Kagame, have increasingly become central to the genocide argument. And out of these factors really has emerged what Linda has alluded to, which is the double genocide theory. And I think other people will touch on that. And I just want to say that I find that it is based very much on two co-quers and ad hominem arguments, equivalence, and all that kind of specious arguments. And maybe we'll get into that later. I also find quite increasingly that the diaspora has become a real battlefield when it comes to genocide denial. If we compare the ways in which the Rwandan government has been tackling genocide denial through legislation, policy, and education. So the diaspora has become a real battlefield when it comes to genocide denial, and I think it is alarming to see to what extent, and this is not surprising because this is something we have argued about when it comes to knowledge making about the genocide. But it's interesting to see how the genocide agenda is being hijacked by non-Rwandan experts claiming access to esoteric knowledge, to which we, unfortunately, as Rwandans, don't have neither the means nor the power to access. I will stop there and let other people join in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Richard. Really interesting to bring in this issue of the diaspora and the idea of it becoming a more transnational debate. So I would now like to bring in Phil Clark.
Thanks, Carolyn. Look, just a couple of quick responses to this question. I agree with everything that the previous presenters have said. In particular, I want to echo the point that both Catherine and James made in their comments about there being some very obvious forms of genocide denial, but also much slipperier forms. And we need to be vigilant, I think, to both of these categories of genocide denial and ready to challenge them publicly whenever they manifest. But I want to add a degree of nuance to that idea, which is that I also think at the same time that there's a spectrum of revisionism about history, and not just about the genocide against the Tutsi, but about any case of mass conflict. And in fact, some revision of history, in fact, is virtuous. We need it. It's a good thing. We needed the revision of the initial history of the genocide that was being propagated around the world, that the genocide was simply caused by some spontaneous eruption of ancient ethnic hatreds. That was a deeply entrenched idea of the causes and the carrying out of the genocide that needed to be rebutted, that needed to be revised. And so not all revisionism is negative. Some of it, in fact, is necessary, and some of it is desperately overdue. While saying that, I think we also have to recognize that in this spectrum of revisionism, there are, of course, incredibly egregious forms of revisionism that require contestation. But even then, I would emphasize in this idea of egregious revisionism that there are some problematic forms of revising history that I would not call genocide denial. And there's a spectrum of problematic revisionism all the way up to genocide denial. And I think one of the things that we have to be very careful of is that we are rightly identifying genocide denial and differentiating it from what we might simply think of as problematic forms of revisionism. Now, I want to give you a concrete example here. I was one of those who 6-7 years ago signed the petition to the BBC complaining about the documentary Untold Story, which Catherine's already mentioned. And I gave evidence to the Ngoga Commission that scrutinized that BBC documentary. When I was pushed by Martin Ngoga in the commission hearings, I said I didn't think that BBC Untold Story was an example of genocide denial. I thought it was an egregious form of historical revisionism. I thought it was an incredibly one-sided story that had interviewed actors who had a whole range of motivations, and their often quite wild claims were allowed to be broadcast completely unchecked. And in doing so, I think the documentary gave us a version of the double genocide thesis, but it also engaged in other forms of egregious revisionism. It was hugely problematic, that documentary, on many levels, but I would not call it genocide denial. And now some of my co-panelists, I think, will disagree with me on that, and we've been talking about this for 5 or 6 years. Problematic and egregious problematic forms of revisionism and egregious forms have to be challenged, but they are different. And I think that we need to identify these things very, very clearly and be very careful about how we use language. Along with that, in differentiating different types and different forms of revisionism, I think we have to recognize that there's a wide range of actors that engage in these practices. Some of them know exactly what they're doing. There are various actors, I would call them hardcore denialists, sometimes in genocide perpetrator communities, sometimes in communities related to those, who have a deliberate personal and political agenda that underpins their genocide denial. But there is a much wider spectrum of actors who engage in problematic and egregious forms of revisionism for their own reasons. Sometimes there are very conscious supporters of genocide denial, and I think I'll call them out here. I think some of the ICTR Defense Council have engaged in this. Christopher Black, Peter Erlinder know exactly what they're doing. They have deliberately propagated a narrative of genocide denial in order to support their particular clients in Arusha. But I think more often than not, what we are dealing with are often the clueless enablers of problematic revisionism or genocide denial. People who often have had no experience of talking about or researching Rwanda, who've stumbled into these debates and nevertheless have become part of the problem. And to a certain extent, I think Jane Corbin and the BBC were part of this. I think they fell into this fetish of new narratives about the past, didn't really understand the issue, didn't understand the complexities, and I think enabled highly problematic forms of revisionism in the process. I would put Erlinder and Black in a completely different category from the likes of Corbyn and the BBC. They're all problematic for their own reasons, but they're not the same. And the final thing I want to say here is that in recognizing that there's a spectrum of revisionism and recognizing that there are lots and lots of problems with all of the characters that I've mentioned here, but they are different from one another, I think sometimes we have cheapened the idea of genocide denial by applying that term willy-nilly to people that we simply disagree with. Now, there are genocide denialists who need to be called that, but I think sometimes we have cheapened that term by applying it to people with whom we simply have a fundamental historical difference. And an example I would give is that going back 8 or 9 years, I was at a conference in Kigali where a member of the Rwandan government called Alison Deforge a genocide denialist. And I felt that that was a cheapening of that term. That was a misapplication of that term. You could disagree with Deforge on many of the stances that she took, but she's palpably on the record, and of course wrote one of the seminal texts on the genocide, Leave None to Tell the Story, that indicate just how wedded she is to the historical truth that the genocide against the Tutsi took place. And so I think, yes, we're going to talk about genocide denial, identifying it and responding to it. I think we also need to be aware that sometimes that term is misused, and I think that that is also problematic. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Phil. Some interesting set of arguments there. Maybe I should bring in somebody else at the end to see if anyone wants to take on any of those points. But lastly, I'll just I'll come to Paul Rukesha. Thank you, Paul. So it's the same question, which is what are how does genocide denial manifest itself? And I just note nobody's mentioned anything much yet about online manifestations. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Paul. Obviously, you're free to comment as you wish. So I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Caroline. So for me, genocide denial manifests itself. So is seen by the genocide deniers when they characterize the Hutu extremist criminals who committed the genocide, and how they characterize the Tutsi, the victims of genocide. So they take the Hutu as Linda mentioned, as a homogeneous group of people without distinction, and a people who was provoked who in their own country, assuming that the Tutsi did not belong to that country, and who killed the president, and assuming the so-called Hutu president was not the president of all Rwandans, reminding the audience that in the last election of President Habyarimana, he won by almost 100%. I think it was 98 or 99%, meaning that even those Tutsis had elected him as their president. And how they characterize the Tutsi is that the Tutsi are provocative people, are sacrifices. And I remember there's a guy, there's a man, he was in the post-genocide government, and he wrote a book explaining how the Tutsi were sacrificed by the RPF, and you would wonder if they were sacrificed in the sense of, those past religious sacrifices, human sacrifices, and still dehumanizing the victims. So I see the genocide denial when they still, even in their writings, still dehumanizing the victims, saying they are provocative, they are sacrifices. So they never say that they were ordinary people, having names, having professions. So, and taking all those Hutus and making them as military targets, saying before the genocide they were provoked, and all of them they were angry because they loved their president. But in the post-genocide, they say, oh, those Hutus we labeled as the angry people, as defending their countries. Now they are innocent people whom the RPF committed genocide to. So they keep shifting their narrative, either making the Hutus as defending their nation, or the Hutus being vulnerable and provoked. So that's how I see this this genocide denial, and it is even increasing in Rwanda now on YouTube channels, because many people are opening their YouTube accounts, and then they use different tricks talking about the socio-economic problems you have, but they sneak in the something related to genocide denial, and they may talk about the education failing, the prices rising in Rwanda, but at the end they find a way to sneak in something about, for example, saying, you know what, the Tutsis who formed the RPF, the Tutsis who fled in 1959, they did not flee because they were threatened or they were massacred. They fled because they wanted to be governed by the Hutu, democratic Hutu majority. So that kind of narrative to distort the history and to rewrite the history to fit their narrative. So that's what's happening now, and it's worrying the way it's even increasing in Rwanda on YouTube channels and other social media. And they present themselves as outspoken, talking about what the RPF, how the RPF are really disrupting the good governance. But really, it's all about genocide denial, because they can't talk about education, economic issues without talking about the genocide denial, something related to genocide denial. So I will stop by now. I will continue later here.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think it's really useful that you mentioned the rising role played by social media, both in Rwanda and kind of internationally. There's a question in the panel there about free speech, so perhaps we'll move on to that when we go on to the general discussion. So I think what we'll do now is we'll move on to our second question, which again I'll put to each of the panelists. So the second question is, what are the major consequences of genocide denial? What are the major consequences of genocide denial? And these might be things like pain inflicted on survivor community, impact on public opinion, the ethics and integrity of the media and or academia, policy consequences, and even future violence. So I think on this occasion, I'll come first to Richard Bender.
Thank you. Look, the consequences are again multiple and diverse, and I think the genocide being the type of crime it is, it has denying genocide has consequences on both on the national community, on the victims, on the survivors, on the wider national Rwandan community. I'm trying to remain specific to the Rwandan genocide, but also I think it robs something of the international community. Other people will focus on other aspect. I just want to say a few things, and I think sometimes the debate centers on survivors, but we forget the dead. And I'm very much aware that I'm Rwandan. I'm a religious. I'm interested in religious philosophy. I'm interested in spirituality. I think that by displacing genocide purely on the realm of real politics, we forget fundamentally the deeper moral, philosophical, and ethical concerns that inform the Rwandan way of life. And I think there is, in my mind, there is a certain spiritual injury that is done to the dead if they are not even recognized, if the injustice that they have suffered is not recognized, and anybody who is aware of the concept of Rwandans, and how we see the dead, and the importance of making sure that their death is recognized, and it is valued, is given recognition amongst the living. It has a tremendous effect on the surviving community. So I worry very much by denying that we incur, worryingly, that we might incur the blame of those who have departed, or the dead, or the victims. And that might not be quite, it might not carry weight for academicians, or hardcore logical thinkers, but I really think that it is a deeply offensive and an injury to the victims that their passing is not recognized. And in the Rwandan philosophy and beliefs, there are dangers attached to not recognizing how that a person has passed violently, and the rituals and symbols that have to accompany to go along that recognition, in terms of creating a quieter and harmonious way of life for the survivors, in terms of their psychological well-being, spiritual well-being, and obviously materialistic prosperity. So that is something I want just to throw in the debate, that the departed and the victims are key to this injury. I think it's beyond words to say what this does to the victims, whether we think about the pain it causes, the devastation, and the offense it causes to them. But the one thing I really want to say is, and maybe other people will comment on that, I wonder if it depends on the nature of the relationship between the people who deny and their denial. And because I think that the thicker the relationship between the denier and the survivor and the victim, and by thick relationships, I'm using Avishai Margalit understanding of thick relationship as underpinning the betrayal that we have seen in genocide. So I think that if this denial comes from those who know better and who realize the injury that has been done to the survivors and the victims, and by that I really mean mostly us Rwandans as informed and witnesses, I think that makes the offense even more grievous. I worry very much about the effect of genocide denial on legislation in Rwanda, and I have to bring this in because obviously, for those who don't know, before I decamped to philosophy, theology, and this abstract stuff, I trained in law, and I studied criminal law and constitutional law, and I have been following with concern the form of legislations that are put into place to mitigate or to limit, to counter genocide denial. And I'm always very conscious of the way law can be applied as a blunt instrument and the power that law has. So my fear is that genocide denials, whether they are internal in a country or actually transnational, and especially in the diaspora, will have more effect and impact on the way robust, stringent legislations will be brought into the country, and actually that they might have an effect that is counterproductive. So I welcome people's opinion on that, but I always see that sort of as somebody who has seen from living in Rwanda how events that take place outside the country can have impact on the Rwandans of the inside. So that really causes me alarm. I work with the younger generation, young second generation, third generation, however you want to name them. And I worry very much about their being exposed through unfiltered social media posts. Paul has spoken about YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, this exposure that is not filtered, and how it might affect a younger generation who are already battling contradictory versions of history, as I noticed when I was working with the Youth Connect dialogues, but also young people who are battling existential frustrations born out of economical challenges or lack of social mobility. On a concluding point, I think it really is dangerous for the wider international community, because Phil alluded to the fact that it is not a binary thing. Denial is not about those who acknowledge genocide and those who deny genocide. There are probably a great range of people in the middle, including those who are uninformed and those who are indifferent. And you worry that people might be exposed to genocide denial before they have even had access to the historical version of the genocide against the Tutsi itself, which complicates the work, obviously, of genocide scholars, of Association of Genocide Survivors, and so on and so forth. I will stop talking.
Thank you so much, Richard. I think that particularly it's so important to mention the first part, of your message about the effect on survivor community and also on the younger generation. So I'm going to put the same question now to Paul Rukesha. So the question, Paul, you keep connecting and disconnecting, so I'll get you while you're here. So it's the major consequences of genocide denial. So this can be about for the survivor community, public opinion, policy consequences, future violence, that type of thing. Thanks.
Okay. So I will start on survivors, the consequences on survivors. It prevents the survivors to be really in the process of healing, and to keep not trusting anyone, and to be in a reconciliation process. And also it prevents, the genocide denial prevents people, non-Rwandans and society who are still fragile in Africa mostly, like in Central African Republic. It prevents people from learning of what happened really, and society that have a heated political environment, like in Kenya. So it prevents people from learning and not to repeat the what happened, and because they get confused who says the truth. When we have growing voices of genocide deniers, it prepares the societies to repeat what happened really, because it doesn't let the people learning from lessons from the history, and then we are doomed, societies are doomed to repeat the history, which is the genocide, to commit the genocide and the other mass atrocities. Yeah, that's what I would say about the survivors and preventing future, genocides.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul. And so same question to James Smith, please. The major consequences of genocide denial.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. So, on the one hand, we could have take this privilege of describing these discussions and debates as, freedom of expression and speech, and it's all part of, academic discourse. And I think, what we've heard from other panelists, has to be at the forefront of our minds. That it isn't just about academic and scholarly debates. It has a major impact on individuals. Listening to Paul describe how it, for survivors, it undermines trust. This is huge, because this is the concept of the double genocide theory, that Tutsis provoked the genocide against themselves or are some way involved. This victim blaming, that because of their own actions somehow brought it upon themselves, is adding to the psychological wounds that are already there. And given the failures of the international community back in 1994 to halt and prevent the genocide, we can look back and make all sorts of reasons why that failure happened. And among us, Linda Melvin has spent the past 27 years researching and writing about that. But it's reprehensible that today we can add to that psychological trauma of survivors that we've been hearing about. So the psychological trauma is one thing, but what is beyond that is that undermining trust that's been gradually building up, continuing to generate fear among survivors, that people don't understand the dangers that are out there, and therefore it could happen again. This is undermining reconciliation. It's undermining rebuilding, and it's extremely damaging to the fabric of the Rwandan community, Rwandan society, and the wider communities. And so it's got significant impact and consequences. And I think that just the final point that I just want to make about that is that the academic discussions and the reportings by journalists and all this on the social media then spills over into policy. And we've already seen last year both the British and the American governments objected to the recognition of the term genocide against the Tutsi that was otherwise accepted and adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, because they prefer to broaden the term out, Rwandan genocide, and the objections are a little strange and bizarre, in that they state that they were other victims, and yet within the statement of the recognition of the genocide against the Tutsi, it's mentioned at least twice that there were Hutu that were also targeted by the government that committed the genocide, but just legally they were targeted, but they weren't targeted as part of the genocide. They were targeted because they were opposing the regime. I know we could talk about that. It's a bigger subject altogether. I don't want to get too far off track there, but only to say, I think in summary, impact on survivors is massive. That has consequences on rebuilding and reconciliation, and there are policy implications. So it's not just a discussion that's happening in universities and some sort of academic discourse that we have the privilege of taking part in.
Thank you, James. So I'll move over now to Linda Melvin. The same question, please. You're muted, Linda.
Okay.
That's good, yeah, we hear you.
Thank you. For the survivors, this isn't something that is commemorated once a year. This is something that they live with every single day. And when the BBC broadcast Rwanda's Untold Story and proposed that more Hutu had died than Tutsi, that is profoundly, profoundly disturbing to me, because this is denial. It's not revisionism. The complaint to the BBC was not about revisionism, but about denial. And the other consequence of this is that work that promotes genocide denial is used by the genocidaires still at large. There are hundreds of them. In the trial of Pascal Simbikangwa in Paris, in his appeal, his lawyers had asked that Rwanda's untold story be shown to the jury. They wanted to convince the jury that the facts of the genocide were not correct and that there was an untold story that everybody else had missed. So they showed the program to the jury in the appeal of Pascal Simbikangwa, who was convicted for 25 years on genocide charges. It emboldens the genocidaire, this sort of material. And that is a profound danger as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Linda. And lastly, the same question then to Phil Clark.
Yeah, let me just add two other consequences of genocide denial that I think we touched on, but maybe haven't spoken about too comprehensively yet. I mean, the first one is the issue of genocide denial is about historical truth. It's about historical accuracy. And there are many, many processes that are predicated on the truth and that are undermined by denial. One of those is justice. This has been a huge preoccupation in the aftermath of the genocide against the Tutsi. Criminal accountability and other forms of accountability for those crimes, whether that's been through Gacaca, whether that's been through the national courts, the ICTR and universal jurisdiction cases, all of that, all of those efforts towards justice hinge upon having a historical record that is believable, that is tested and that can withstand serious scrutiny. And genocide denial undermines that. It makes the larger pursuit of justice and various forms of accountability much more difficult. It also, I would say, and I think both Richard and Paul have touched on this, it undermines reconciliation. Truth is vital for more harmonious, more productive, more constructive relations into the future. If there is a fundamental disjunct, if there is a fundamental disagreement over the basic facts of what happened in 1994 in Rwanda, then it makes any serious attempt at reconciliation incredibly difficult to enact. And I think we're seeing this in Rwanda at the moment. I think we're seeing it in the Rwandan diaspora, but I think we're even seeing it in contexts far beyond that. Genocide denial undermining relations between people. It's producing bad faith. It's producing distrust. I would go as far as to say that it damages the body politic. I think I'm an Australian living here in the UK. I think British society is pathologically, societally in denial about the impact of British colonialism around the world. And that, I think, injures British relations with its former colonies, but it also injures the British body politic because of this lack of honesty, this lack of willingness to engage systematically and robustly with the crimes of the past. And I think the issue of genocide denial plays out in the same way. I think it injures the body politic in Rwanda, but it also injures the body politic in all of the other parts of the world where genocide denial is prevalent at the moment.
Okay, thanks so much, Phil. We had two more questions, but because of time and we're getting in so many questions in the Q&A here, I'm going to combine our last two questions just so the panelists are clear. So I'll try to state them quite clearly for you. So the next question will be, next time genocide denial is given a major public platform, how should we respond collectively to it? For example, writing letters, open debate, disengagement, social media campaigns. And the add-on part for that then will be, what else more broadly should we be doing to contest genocide denial? So if you could address both the specific part of the question, next time we get an event like this, how should we respond? And more generally, what should we be doing to respond to genocide denial? So I'll come first to Linda Melvin.
Thank you very much. We need to write letters, open debate, have campaigns, have events like this. I just wanted to say quickly, though, that there's an eminent French military historian who, this is in my book, he says that there's a huge lack of awareness about this. It wasn't until 2008 that his name is Stéphane Audouin Rousseau, when he visited Rwanda for the first time and was invited to attend a conference, that he realized what a massive event this was. He said he barely noticed it at the time, and he now believed it the most significant event of the late 20th century to challenge the social scientists. And in another 50 years, this debate would be of the greatest importance. And I believe that to be true. I think the failure at the time in 1994 by the British press to adequately, or the Western press to adequately describe what was happening in the 18 government first inquiry into this, the Western press was accused of having contributed to the crime itself by its reporting. And I think the same is true today. There's been a recognition of the massacres in Bosnia. This is just simply not true of Rwanda. And I think there is a form of racism that we have yet to recognize when it comes to this. What should we do to contest genocide denial? Lock them up. There are hundreds of them all over the world, in Australia, in Germany. The majority of those who planned, financed, instigated, ordered, committed, or otherwise aided and abetted the extermination of the Tutsi are dispersed across various countries. We must find out where the money is coming from. One story completely ignored recently by the British press was the claim in the trial of Rusesabagina that his foundation had contributed to a militia in the DRC, and who knows, to this campaign of denial. I wrote in 2014 to every member MP on the all-party parliamentary group on the Great Lakes region genocide prevention to tell them that the broadcast of BBC's Rwanda's Untold Story was offensive and misleading. There was not one response. And I do believe that a concerted effort in 2014 may have spared the spread of denial today. Genocide denial is hate speech. It's an integral part of the crime and ensures the crime continues. It ensures the crime has no end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. And now the same question, please, to James Smith. So what should we do in response to the next time a genocide denier is given a platform, and more broadly, should we be doing to respond to this?
Yeah, so I signed the letter that was organised opposing the event at Cambridge University, and I would do so again. I think it's the right thing to do, and I think in this circumstance, because of certain boundaries that I felt were crossed in terms of victim blaming, double genocide, the consequences that we've spoken about in terms of that particular author's a book and narrative. However, we've discussed on this call on this panel that there are almost concentric circles of or a spectrum of outright denial to different forms of revisionism and distortion, and where should the line be drawn in terms of well, this is a narrative that is, you know, rehabilitating the genocidaires, as Linda has described, and that is a consequence. I know I hadn't mentioned that it is immensely important that that those that are behind these ideas are emboldened by these narratives, and therefore need to be sidelined and opposed. So, but along that spectrum, that there are those that may be participating in, you know, legitimate, you know, research, and or maybe misguided in some way, and I think it is important that we that we do engage and dialogue. So so first of all, I think specifically, yes, it is. But we should have a, you know, a network, and be prepared to respond more swiftly when you know, there is a consensus among a certain group that this is going to be on a certain line. But at the same time, I think that we've got to become more confident, robust in having conversations, and difficult conversations. And I think, just going on to the wider point about engagement and collaboration, how do we deal with this issue of denial? First of all, thank you both to Catherine and to Caroline for bringing us together for this event. There needs to be more such events because we're not going to solve the issues in 2 hours here. We need to foster more collaboration with others that are dealing with this issue. We've talked about the Holocaust. There's the Armenian community that have been dealing with denial for nearly the best part of a century. And there are networks like the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance that have looked deeply into the problem of denial and distortion. There was a great event recently held by the Wiener Library looking at the Holocaust and genocide against the Tutsi. And it's great that there's more and more recognition that this is a pattern, it's a problem, but we all have to sort of talk a lot more to each other and create these collaborations. If something out of this this panel can lead on to greater collaborations, I think it would be a great outcome. Finally, there needs to be a dialogue with policymakers. The issue of, you know, the UK and their non-recognition of the genocide against the Tutsi, I think is troubling, and we need to try and understand what's the motive behind that. I think that the British government need to explain what their rationale is more clearly, and we need to dialogue with them and try and help create a shift in that position.
Thanks very much, James. I'm going to put the question next to Phil Clark, and if you don't mind me mentioning Phil to those of audience members that are not aware, Phil quite publicly put his name to the letter that protested against the appearance of Judy Reaver at Cambridge University, and then publicly removed his name in order to engage with the discussion. So I'll leave it to you, Phil, to address the question.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Carolyn. That's where I was going to start anyway, so you've done it for me. Look, I think that the Judy Reaver example is a really important, concrete case to flesh out some of what we're talking about today. So we're obviously talking about Reaver's book, In Praise of Blood. I must confess, I read the book pretty soon after it came out. I don't think it's even a particularly good book. I mean, apart from the fact that I disagree with much of it substantively, I don't think it's particularly well written. I don't think it's particularly well researched. It needed a good editor. It's got many, many flaws. And my initial reaction to it for the first couple of years was to try to ignore it. I thought this book, with its wild claims, revising events in Rwanda between 1990 and 1994, would simply go away. And it seemed, at least initially, that that's what was happening. And so in that sense, the job was done. But this book built momentum. as many of you will have seen, it's taken on a life of its own. And I think one of the things that has produced that momentum is the way that the social media discourse around Judy Reaver and around that book has played out. I think in many respects, it has emboldened her. Now, initially, I signed a letter protesting against her appearance in Cambridge a couple of months ago. And in some discussions in the background with various people and after reflection, I thought that's not going to work. Deplatforming her, not allowing her work to be scrutinized publicly in a space like that, in fact, is an aid to her, and it's an aid to her book. And so I unsigned the letter. And of course, that produced all sorts of bad blood with people that I don't want to have bad blood with. I attended the event, and I will say that I think it was important that Reaver was held to account in that public space. Now, Cambridge, I think, did a very poor job of curating that event, and I think the Centre for Geopolitics also has questions to be asked about exactly how they ran that event. But nevertheless, what was important in that space was that two people who I think Reaver may have gone into the event thinking would be supporters of her, in fact, took her to task on things that she said in the book and things that she has said about conflict in the Great Lakes, namely Philip Rainchins and Jason Stearns. And what was clear in the event was that both of them, who I think may be sympathetic to certain things that Reaver says in that book, could not abide the totality of what she has published and what she said, and they would not let her off the hook. And she had no response. So when she was held to account in a public space, her arguments fell apart very quickly. Now, one of the things that people will, I hope, notice if you've been watching Reaver and the momentum around her book online, is that event, I think, really took the wind out of her sails. It backfired for her quite spectacularly. Because in an academic space, she was asked the kinds of tough questions that I don't think she has been asked up until now. And I think what that shows is that with certain types of problematic revisionism, what is best, in fact, is to get in the ring. And it's to take these people, these authors, these commentators on their own terms, challenge their claims directly and with evidence, and see if they can respond to it. And in the case of Judy Reaver, she couldn't. And she has a tendency, I think, to react incredibly defensively when, in these rare moments, she is publicly scrutinized. And I think it was a good advertisement for the kind of academic scrutiny that universities are built upon. She floundered. And I think that I think that kind of academic discourse can play a very, very important role. It has to be curated well. There has to be scope for direct challenge. So what I'm not interested in is the kind of thing that I think Reaver enjoyed in Belgium and in the Netherlands and in the US, where she was hosted by universities, but in a format that allowed almost no challenge. I think that is useless. What I'm talking about are spaces being opened up where challenge is possible, where public scrutiny is possible. And I think in the case of Reaver and others like her, that is the best way to undermine the very dangerous narratives about the past that they're trying to propagate.
Thanks, Phil. Of course, one of the problems with being online is that it's less easy to always put the questions to the person. And they were quite carefully at manicuring that event in the way that they chose to do so. And the recording is still, to my knowledge, not available for people to re-scrutinize.
That's a problem as well, I think. Cambridge told us that the recording would go up. And I think there are questions to be asked there about why it's not up. That's part of academic discourse, is these things are on the record. Your reputation it depends on these things being on a permanent record for later appraisal. So Cambridge told us this event would be held in a particular way, and I don't think it was. So there's a question to the university there.
Thank you. Okay, so then the same question then to Paul Rukesha. So Paul, it's what should we do in response to when a genocide denier is given a platform, and more broadly, what should we do to contest genocide denial?
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. I think we should not only be reactive. I think we should be proactive and create that network of academician experts and other people, and share the content we have. We have a huge amount of testimonies of what happened, and I think the deniers count on the ignorance of many people, because they don't know about Rwanda, about Africa, most of them, they hear about the genocide against the Tutsi, but in a remote area in Africa where they haven't set a foot for the first time. And I think sharing testimonies, having platforms that inform people of what happened, and really sharing the historical accuracy of what happened in Rwanda, not only in the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, but even before, because genocide it's a process. It was created long before 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. I think that proactivity will allow us to to really be in a position where we would say, so you're saying this, but we have someone who talked about it in a way that is clearer and accurate. Yeah.
Thanks very much. And for any of the audience interested, Paul works for the Genocide Archive of Rwanda, where you can find quite a lot of those resources and many testimonies and other artifacts. So if you're interested in finding out some of these sources, that's what the Aegis Trust is doing in Rwanda. And so I'll give you, Richard Bender, the last word on this before we move on to the general discussion.
Thank you very much. I will finish. I will start by actually the last question, just to emphasize the point that Paul has just made, the bit about being reactionary, and I think that has been our problem in terms of countering genocide denial, is that we seem to be reacting at we are not leading the agenda, so we seem to be quite reactionary. And in this, I see the fact that we have done a poor job of drawing lessons from the tradition of Holocaust denial and so on and so forth. And there is a lack of networking, really, all these historical atrocities in order to sort of generate really what would be probably a general theory of a historical denial to help us create a framework. So just to emphasize what Paul has said, we can't allow ourselves to really react, to be reactionary. I think we have to lead the agenda. As to what we do when genocide denial or denialists are given a platform, I noted just Catherine and Caroline that you use the word collectively respond, and my quick reaction to that was the response doesn't have to be collective. Collective response take forever. You just look at how long it took us to find a date to organize this panel. I generally think that as soon as these things happen, and I agree with those who have spoken before me, we have to engage. I understand what Deborah Lipstadt says when she says that it's not she's not keen on sharing the platform with deniers, but I think we have to engage, and we have to engage, in my opinion, we have to engage quite individually or locally, depending on where we find ourselves, and just create what other people have called a list of individual reactions linked together by a common sense of fact and moral grasp. And I think that is really important. And I think some of the steps we have to follow is, as soon as you detect that platform, you detect it, we have to detect it, and we have to act or react quickly, whether we write letters, we ring the people who are organizing this, we email people, we literally, we have to be relentless in terms of keeping these people engaged, in terms of realizing that the event that they're going to stage is contested, is contestable, and is actually a denial of historical facts. And I think there is always a lag in information and communication. I think our networks have to work really fast in terms of disseminating these events, communicating what is going on, so that then we can strategize for a collective action through our different networks. And I think it's always important to lobby and enlist the solidarity of those who are still in those indifferent category, because I think that they are there to be won over. So I just want to insist on that, not waiting for collective action necessarily, but collective action has got to follow these local, individual, quick, spontaneous action and actions and reactions. And later on, I think we can then begin to strategize collectively. And finally, I want to speak. I think we some of us pretend, or we are academics, and we believe in the role of the academic to do this. And I think what we have, the service we have to do to public discourse, to the international community, is to keep producing a robust research. Really, there is such a thing as academic truth, robust research, and we have to do this in a tireless manner. You know, I was listening to Linda saying how she wrote to different people. I think we really have to know that this is a non-stop event. It's just a lifetime commitment. So I think we have to be committed to this, doing this in a tireless manner. But I also think that we have to do this transnationally, that's the cooperation, but also to begin to train the next generation of academics and students in these things. And I don't know if we have to be very militant about the curriculum, academic curriculum, and how we involve this. And I want to finish with a point that Linda alluded to, and we didn't seem to pick it up, but I think there is an undercurrent of racism, because this is a genocide of the poor, and the poor always need the strong and the rich and the powerful and the Westerners and the whites to speak for them. And I think one of the ways we have to do this really is to understand that this is an injury that has been to the human race, and how we include this in curriculum is very key. And I know James is doing this with the Aegis Trust and other people, but I think there is a great deal of work that needs to be done on pedagogy and the curriculum and the training and the preparation of future academics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, for finishing off the panel. So thanks for all of you for all the really enriching discussion that we've had so far. I can see that in the questions we now have a really large number of fascinating questions. So I'd like to just thank the audience for engaging so carefully. I hope we can get through as many of these as we possibly can, because they're really important. So I'm going to now hand over to Catherine Gilbert, who will field these questions to our panelists.
Thanks, Caroline. And yeah, thank you again to all of our panelists for that fascinating discussion. I've been going through the questions as they've been coming in and trying to collate them. Some of them have already been covered in the discussion, some of the questions that were asked earlier on. But I want to stick actually with the point that Richard just made about education, and because there have been several questions come in on this sort of generational issue. For example, with children of the former perpetrators, for example, who are active in many diasporic communities, what can we do to actively change the minds of these young people when they're in a very specific environment? But also for those of you who work with students, how do you navigate these challenges of freedom of speech versus genocide denial from a pedagogical perspective? So what can we do from that pedagogical perspective to educate the younger generations? So I don't want to identify people to respond necessarily. So if anyone wants to jump in on that, please feel free. Alternatively, I can call on someone. Phil, perhaps actually working in the university environment, you might like to respond to that first.
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone in a teaching position has a responsibility to two things. One is to present alternative perspectives on contentious historical events, but also to equip our students, whether it's at primary school, secondary school, or university levels, to differentiate truth from bullshit. And I think that there is a tendency in some teaching environments to do the former, to say to a relativistic point of view, all perspectives count, and we're just going to throw all of these different interpretations at students of any age and expect them to be able to sift convincing perspectives out of that. And I think it's the second thing that we really have to emphasize at all levels of education is we have to equip people in how to analyze and how to weigh historical evidence. And it's a very tricky thing to do, but I think it's absolutely vital. I think I've heard the phrase fake news used. This reminds us that we live in an era of enormous conspiracy theorizing and contestation over historical truths. This is in the ether at the moment. This is the zeitgeist, not just around mass conflict, but we're seeing it in all walks of life. I think it's the responsibility of academic and educational institutions to start to tackle that, to actually say to our students, this is the environment that you're growing up in, and these are the skills that you're going to need. That doesn't mean blocking your ears to things that you might find uncomfortable. It's listening to those things, but having the skills to be able to appraise them in a convincing fashion. And I think all of us in educational institutions have to take that task very seriously, particularly at the moment.
Just to add on quickly, just because Phil is there. I remember when our PhD started, Phil. I don't know if you remember, and I'm sure James remember as well. And I think I'd written the first research really trying to introduce the narrative of children of perpetrators into the debate, and that seems to create a minor tension, because those sort of new perspectives are always viewed with suspicion, and that's because obviously we're operating in this environment saturated with genocide denial, half-truths, and the contrasting narratives. I think deep down there is space for academic criticality, and we have to deal with that. One of the things I've noticed, which helps a student to know that they are not sliding on, or myself as a researcher working on alternative narratives, is that you have to always be able to engage with the victims of the genocide themselves, and that they have to be some of the validity of your work has got to go about can you engage with this? Is this worth discussing? So if you avoid this audience, you have to know already that you are on dangerous slope. Sorry, I just wanted to complete that, Phil.
Thanks. And I think we've lost Paul at the moment, but perhaps we seem to have lost James as well. I was going to ask James if you wanted to weigh in on that from the point of view of the Kigali Genocide Memorial and the work of the Aegis Trust and its peace education program. But we might have to come back to that in a minute. But actually, I'll pick up then. There have been a couple of questions on fake news and on misleading news information. So we've had a question from Canada and from Germany and other parts of the world asking, how can we fight genocide denial in the time of fake news? Should we respond to these fake news items or just ignore them? And what, especially if that's on social media, and how should we react to misleading articles like the superficial media coverage on the arrest of Paul Rusesabagina and other examples? So I wonder if perhaps Linda, you might want to weigh in on this one.
I do think that journalism has a problem here. And I come to this not as an academic, as you know, but an investigative journalist. And when I look at some of the accounts, I'm quite frankly baffled. The accounts perhaps I'm thinking particularly now of Michela Wrong, you know, who has written about the assassination of Habyarimana as though it triggered the genocide. And this is really, this is so problematic, you know. Michela Wrong gave an interview on April the 16th to the president of the US Foreign Press Association, and she was asked about the assassination of Habyarimana. And she said, I don't know what the level of proof would ever be regarded as definitive, because you get a lot of people obsessed with ballistics and where people thought they saw the missiles being launched from and what it sounded like. I don't know if ever you've been in a war zone, she continued, but I've certainly never been able to tell when there is explosion, where it comes from. So I'm a little suspicious of all these witnesses who have been questioned over the years. There wasn't a war zone in Rwanda when that missile was fired. It was fired into a silent night sky. There was a peace agreement. That's why the UN was in the country. The witnesses who saw the missiles depart, one of them is a Belgian doctor, Dr. Passuch, who was so close to the missiles fired from Kanombe that he heard the whoosh. Now, whatever this isn't investigative journalism. To ignore 4 direct witnesses, to claim there's a war zone when there isn't, and furthermore, to ignore the scientific, or to put them in a footnote, the scientific reports that have been concluded into this, baffles me, because if ever an event needed careful reporting, it is this one. So I don't know what the motives are for this sort of reporting, but it is quite dangerous. Now, Dr. Reinhard Wolfgang, who is one of the audience today, wrote from Germany to me recently that a similar problem exists there. And I would say that this is a worldwide phenomenon. You know, in Australia, there are huge problems in Queensland about denialism. Writing letters to newspapers, writing letters, challenging all of this. It's really important that we do whatever form it takes. Thank you.
Catherine, so
I was about to say, James, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I do apologise. I dropped out for a moment or two, so this may have been covered by other panellists, but to emphasise that there's a great need in sort of secondary school, high school level to begin to introduce these themes and histories into the curriculum, and I say that with a great deal of hesitation, knowing the challenge that teachers have of even conveying the magnitude and detail and the complexity of the Holocaust in a few lessons. How then do they begin to touch on other genocides? But there are some great examples of schools doing this in this country. You see the work at Wootton Bassett Academy and in Hampton Boys School, and you know, we can learn from them about their experience and advocate and lobby for this to become more widespread when we find and see examples of good practice. But I'd emphasize a point that Phil made. Because of the confusion that's happening out there, and not just in relation to the genocide against the Tutsi, but right across the board, this blurring between fact and myth, there has to be a redoubling of the efforts and helping to equip teachers to further provide the skills to their students on just how to develop these critical thinking skills and apply them to the real world around us. It's one of the essential skills of our time, not just because of the theme that we're talking about in relation to into Rwanda, but because there's just so much growth of conspiracy theory out there at the moment that's not going to go away soon.
Sorry, yes, I think this is a really important discussion that we need to keep having, and I'm sure we will as we go forwards. Would anyone else like to say anything about the issue of education? If not, I'll move on to the next group of questions. So we've had a lot of questions about terminology and about this spectrum of revisionism and denial that we've been approaching from a lot of different angles here. So I'll try and make sense of these. So how first of all, what are the metrics that we can use to determine the elements of this spectrum first of all, and how do we deal with genocide denial arguments and agendas that often get mixed up with critics of the Rwandan government and politics? So there's again this blurring of people who may have legitimate criticisms of the current Rwandan policies, but then that gets lumped in with this sort of blanket terminology of genocide denial. So how do we navigate that? And who would like to jump in there?
I mean, I'm happy to, Catherine. I mean, given I think I introduced the issue of there being a spectrum of these things. I mean, I think, and obviously what's at stake here is that we're trying to distinguish between what I'm calling problematic revisionism and genocide denial. And I think that there is a distinction between these things. So how do we distinguish them? The first, I think, is on substance. And I think sometimes we can see authors who, not out of a cynical agenda, but straight up will say, I'm not denying the genocide, but. Now, sometimes I think that is a reasonable thing to say. A commentator can say, I acknowledge that the genocide against the Tutsi happened in 1994. However, there are other issues that we need to talk about. There are new historical pieces of evidence that have come to light. Let's debate that. And so I think substantively, we need to, the first thing we should be looking for is, firstly, is there an explicit acknowledgement from somebody that the genocide happened? Then the substantive question becomes, what else is being revised and how? Is there a sense that things that we can show to be evidentially true are being challenged with flimsy evidence? And we have to take this on the substantive terms. And I think, again, that's why there's a danger of just lumping these things together. I think this becomes a very homogeneous category where we take something that is revising history, and it may be problematic for certain reasons, and it warrants challenge, but it's not denial. So I think the first thing is we actually have to pay very close attention to the substantive claims that are being made by commentators. That's the first thing. The second thing we then have to look at is, what is the motivation behind the person who's making these claims? Are they doing it out of some political agenda? Are they doing it to cover their own role in the genocide? Or are they these kind of clueless, these unwitting enablers who I talked about before? Now, they may be open to scrutiny. We should still criticize them, but we may want to recognize that they've stumbled into an arena that they don't understand that well, in which case I think they have to be tackled differently. So I think focusing on the substance, but also focusing on the motivation behind these forms of revisionism, means that we are at least acknowledging the thing that we are worried about. We're taking it on its own terms. We're understanding it. We're understanding the dynamics behind it. And it's only when we've understood that substance and those motivations that then we can start to respond to it in an effective way. And I think, again, if we just lump everything into the category of genocide denial, we make it more difficult to respond to those kinds of statements.
I definitely agree with the attention that is needed, and not to abuse the charge of genocide denial, because it can genuinely be detrimental to the work that is being done. I think that we as people have researched Rwanda, the genocide against the Tutsi, there is always going to be this issue of the critique of the current critique of the current government. And I think that's what I was trying to do. And I talked about the way the RPF, its prosecution of the war, the way the country has been led under its aegis and President Kagame's aegis, and how they have been recuperated and put to the service of genocide denial. And I can't emphasize enough. I think although the metrics are not easy, which the problem with social sciences and our qualitative methods most of the time, it's not an exact science. But I think there are always indicators, in my opinion, that people, as Phil say, are prepared to engage with the research. I think the but is essential if people say we acknowledge that the genocide against the Tutsi has taken place. So that gives space to develop knowledge around the genocide against the Tutsi, because I think it will be also detrimental to knowledge around the genocide to have this event, this core event of the genocide against the Tutsi quoted in something that is not in discourse that is open to contestation, to debate, but is not allowed to be challenged. So, for instance, some people will say, people challenge me to say, well, we accept that the genocide took place, but we don't believe in the time frame of October 1990 to the end of 1994. Now, for me, that opens room for debate, right? But as long as somebody doesn't say, in those time, nothing happened, or the Tutsi killed themselves, or the Tutsi baited the Hutu in killing them, those are two different things. The other important issue, in my opinion, is, and Linda alluded to that, is the issue of numbers, whether it is 1,500,000, 800,000, and sometimes that is the fact that we can't agree on the number, because let's face it, the metrics do not exist in the quantity, in the numbers as well. So I think we have to be prepared to say what is the core of what we consider as genocide denial. And I suppose that really is one of the things that literature and academic research has to cement, is what we see as an undeniable core of what should be accepted around the genocide against the Tutsi, and what is open to growth, to enrichment, and to academic debate.
Thanks, Richard. James, were you about to add something there?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult to tease out when comments are made around revisionism or the history around the genocide against the Tutsi. To separate that out from those that are aiming to undermine the government, and the reason for this is just because every time there is any new publication or new comment or new article, it's taken up on social media by those who are vehemently opposed to the government and saying, there we go, and see, they're just as bad as the previous guys. And I think that this is where it becomes so murky and difficult, because it's like constantly the water's being stirred, and it's difficult almost to know the motive of those that originate the articles, from where they got the information, and who's using it for what purpose. And I remember a period 20 years ago when there were survivors, Tutsi survivors, who had a very nuanced approach to recognizing suffering in Rwanda, and who made statements, even though their entire families had been destroyed by the intent of genocide, that they recognized there were other orphans, other widows of war, those that had fled the Congo, that had fled to the DRC or Zaire as it was then, and were in camps and had maybe lost family because of disease or violence. And those Tutsi survivors wanted to recognize the pain. It wasn't about the big crime and the specificity of the crime, but about you can't quantify or compare the pain that one widow or one orphan feels, or the loss or the challenge that they have. But over time, because the different experiences in that region were becoming formulated into these narratives, particularly of double genocide, and then that was being weaponized in return against the current government in Rwanda, I observed how this sense of trying to reach out, develop this sort of universality, if you like, of loss that different Rwandans felt. It was being undermined because of the polarization, and I don't know whether this is something that's always happened through history, or because of media, social media, we're more inclined to become divided and polarized as societies. But anyway, it's all that to say is that maybe it wasn't all intended, that it would cause all that fear and mistrust that Paul was describing about, but that fear and mistrust is so real, it's so entrenched, that I think the question that you pose, Catherine, or that's been posed by the audience or participants, that how do you tease out the narratives that are genuine, and those that are there to try and shed a light on the government, or those that are just taking, I guess, objection to the policies of the government, and those that are just part of this wider ideological movement connected to the former regime. It's so difficult, and what that means is that we, those that are trying to address the problem of genocide denial and distortion, we do need to appreciate the vast complexities and all these different ramifications, and it means that we got to invest a lot of energy in it, and effort and time. There just isn't a simple fix to all of this. Sorry to sound very negative about it all, but there's been a very long period, 25 years of opportunities where there could have been real progress in understanding the complexities, but because it's been weaponized for political purposes for so long, it's difficult to unpick that.
Yeah, thanks, James. I think what you're saying there also relates to a very important point that's been made in the audience questions about the link between genocide denial and other forms of hate speech. And I know this is something that Caroline and I have been talking about and thinking about what we can do to collaborate moving forwards, as well as how can we understand genocide denial in relation to other forms of hate speech and extremism? Are these completely different concepts, or is there a sort of spectrum? And obviously now we're moving away from the more sort of legitimate forms of, the more, we're moving into sort of a different direction here, but yeah, I'd like to know your thoughts on this. Richard, would you like to
No,
start?
I was thinking aloud. I'm wondering if there is a point in trying to imagine a sort of transnational gacaca, a platform in which this genocide denial is not taboo, because whether we like it or not, this is a situation that is going to continue. And when we entrench our position, what started as innocuous minor speech solidify and radicalize over time. So I wonder whether we have to begin to think and to mobilize really people interested in this, academics, because I think we have to begin to find a language of engagement that doesn't buy into the hate and the confrontational. I don't know if I'm thinking about, is that Rosenberg who talks about nonviolent communication, and how we create platforms in which this transnational dialogue happens around this sensitive topic. How it can be curated, how it cannot be curated, I don't know. But I think there should be a way of creating a space where this actually is created. This dialogue happens. I think Rwandan culture privilege dialogue, and I think since the 2010, dialogue has become a framework through which the Rwandan government and Rwandan policy tries to see things, and I really wonder how. And this is not a solution, but I wonder if there is a gacaca type transnational or transnationally to debate these things. James touched on a very important point about recognizing the pain of the other. I remember when I wrote about this in my thesis back in 2008, it sounded a bit revolutionary, but really it isn't, because I think the problems of Rwanda do not have to be a zero-sum proposition. But the only way we avoid the zero-sum conundrum, we accept your pain only if you accept ours. And it builds up. And I can see how gradually from 2010, when I was writing my thesis, to 2021, the tone has become more entrenched, more vitriolic. And I wonder if we should have really anticipate these things and begin to create space where these issues can be created. How it happens, that's why we have so many brains in the audience. But we have to have a transnational gacaca where people can begin to feel the pain and talk around these issues.
Thanks. I'm afraid we're running out of time. We've just got 3 minutes left. So I wondered if, following on from Richard's fascinating proposition there, I wonder if we could just give each of the remaining panelists, I'm afraid we've lost Paul, if we could give the other 3 panelists just a minute to say any closing reflections that you'd like to make. So Linda, if I come to you first.
Because you know, the offence caused to survivors is massive. The fact this material emboldens the genocidaire is really very important. But there's another consequence, and it's my own, and that is while I'm considering denial and reading it with increasing concern, I'm not doing my other work. I have a pile of documents on the banking operations in 1994, how all the major banks in New York and here and in France carried on with the finance for the interim government as though it was just any old government. The World Bank archive, as far as I know, hasn't been properly looked at. As far as I know, there's no PhD, I don't think, on the intra-Hamway. I'd like to know, where is the serious work on the intra-Hamway? The sort of work that Hélène Dumas in France has undertaken, which is utterly remarkable. I think there's a problem that people in this country aren't considering the work that's been done in France. I think that's very important. I think that there is a divide between the work done in French and the work done in English, and I think that we have to bridge that. And as far as I'm concerned, my main task is not batting back genocide denial. It's continuing to research this massive crime, which people I don't think have yet properly understood, or the institutional racism that underpinned our own response to it in this country. So there's an enormous amount of work that still needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. Phil, any final words?
Just one final thought, which is we've talked a lot about genocide denial as an international phenomenon produced by international journalists, international commentators, but of course it's a major issue inside Rwanda and continues to be. Whether that's because of generational change, young people coming through, sometimes knowing their history, not always knowing it, perhaps being susceptible to narratives on social media. I think the Aegis Trust is clearly playing a very important role in targeting that kind of concern. But I think we have to recognize that tackling genocide denial in different places amongst different communities requires different types of responses. And what might work in the international sphere with denial and revisionism amongst academics, amongst commentators, amongst journalists, amongst policymakers is one thing. Tackling it in the way that it manifests inside Rwanda is something else. It's around young people, it's around convicted genocide perpetrators. It's also a regional question. Genocide denial across the border in the DRC is a big deal. It's very well organized. There's a propaganda machine there that is also influencing denialist tendencies inside Rwanda. So these things are happening in lots and lots of different spaces, using lots and lots of different means, motivated by very different things. And all of them need different responses depending on where they're happening. Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. And James, I'll come to you for your final words.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. As Linda was speaking, I was really empathizing that there's a huge opportunity cost in having to deal with denial, because we all, have got so many other things that we meant to be getting on with, and it's always like comes over like a torpedo, it was with all the consequent massive distractions that it leads to. But I think we have to sort of almost build it in to part of our time and recognize that it's not just one person. It tends to land on Linda's shoulders, or in this case Catherine and Caroline, your shoulders, to organize events and or write letters. And I just think the more that others, myself included, can contribute in a small way to addressing these complex problems, the better it will be for everybody. But just to look forward, it's again, Linda just reminded me that, just in the way that I think we're paraphrasing Mark Twain, and perhaps everything gets attributed to him that does not. But it's genocide denial. It gets halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on, and it's going to continue to be the case. But thankfully there are those researchers out there, and a growing number of researchers, and growing networks. And we need to find ways, as Paul, he's not here, we're on the call, he's dropped off, but he reminded us we've got to be taking this forward. We've got to stop reacting and being proactive, and get those testimonies out there, get that research out there. We've got to think actively about how genocide, history knowledge, critical thinking can really get into the curriculum. And finally, I hope out of this session, these conversations will continue, that there will be collaborations with others, because I think it's only by joining up and creating a common network and an understanding of the problem can we ever begin to address it. And finally, we do have to find ways, and I hope that will, something that might come out of this event, find ways to talk to some of the policymakers that are frankly, I think, maybe try and understand their motives for perhaps being influenced by some of the sort of distortions that are going on. With that, I'll leave it. It's a massive task ahead, but thank you all for, Catherine and Caroline, especially for organising this, and to the panelists for giving your time. And I'm sorry that there's so many questions. I think you've done a great job of summarising them and bringing them together, Catherine. But it's great to see that there's a huge amount of engagement with these issues. So I'm very grateful to everybody that's joined and participated.
Thank you so much. So it just remains. Oh, Richard, did you want to add one final thing there? Oh, you're on mute.
James was talking about the questions, and there are so many we haven't been able to answer. And I was wondering if we can actually copy and paste them really somewhere so that when we have time, we can actually email or continue the conversation with the questions that have been asked. But because there are so many of them that are so vital, so if there is a way, Catherine, that you can make sure that they stay available, and then the conversation can continue. Thank you.
Yeah, I've taken a record, so I'll make sure that happens. Thanks. And yes, thank you to everyone who asked questions. I'm so sorry that we weren't able to answer even half of them, but it's been absolutely fascinating. And our sincerest thanks to all of our panelists for your generous contributions, and to my co-host Caroline, and to everyone who attended today. So thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.